What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 competitive budget decks for the January 2019 format. Now, some of you guys may not be able to afford the best decks that I discussed in my top 5 meta decks of the January 2019 format, but that's okay because surprisingly, there's actually quite a bit of overlap between these two lists. And the thing is, yeah, if you want to play competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, sometimes it can get really expensive, especially if you want to play the best of the best decks, but that doesn't mean you have to break the bank. And that's why I make this video for you guys. Every deck that's on this list is going to be in about the $100 to $150 price range, which compared to something like $600, $700, $800 you might pay for the highest of tier 1 decks, that is definitely a bargain, even though it's still a little bit expensive compared to what you might expect. But before we get into it, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you guys don't miss a single upload. And if you really love the content that I produce on this channel, then consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because it's thanks to people like Miguel that I'm able to bring you this content on a daily basis. So if you're interested, hit the join button down below or check out the links in the description. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off with number 5, we have a good old favorite of mine that usually makes it on this list in some form or another, Gem Knight FTK. I really can't stop talking about Gem Knight FTK from a budget player's perspective because the deck is so incredibly cheap. What I love about this deck is that because it's an FTK and because it plays in its own way, pretty much the only cards that you're going to need for this deck are Gem Knight cards, which are relatively inexpensive. And the fact that you're able to play a deck that can not only just FTK your opponent flat out, you don't have to play any hand traps. The sole win condition of your deck is to win on turn 1 before your opponent even gets the chance to play. So because of that, you don't have to follow conventional means of needing to play hand traps because you just want to have as many combo materials as possible. And that actually brings the price of these decks down significantly when you don't have to play the hand traps. Now, there might be an expensive card or two in here, like say, something like Nightmare Unicorn, which shuffles back some of your combo pieces so you can pull off the full FTK in certain scenarios, but ultimately, the price that you can get this deck and what you're getting out of it, it's a lot of fun, and honestly, it's topped YCSs, so it's not like it's completely out of, reality to be able to play a deck like this and do well at the competitive level. So definitely something you might want to consider, not to mention that even if you do go second, you're playing a bunch of big-ass Gem Knights that can just beat over your opponent's stuff and probably OTK them the following turn. That is going to bring us on though to number 4, and for number 4 we have Pendulum Magician. Very similarly to Gem Knight FTK, Pendulum Magician has also been able to hang around in the top cut of YCSs, and the cool thing about this is because everything was reprinted in a single set and reprinted just so heavily in that set as well, Pendulum Magician is actually one of the cheapest decks at the moment, and we're counting main and extra deck here. For all of these decks, the main and extra can be acquired for about $100 to $150, and Pendulum Magician is no exception to this. What I love about it is that Pendulum Magician is kind of like the strongest standing pendulum deck still remaining, and that's because it's able to pump out multiple negations with very little resources. I mean, as long as you have a hand of Pendulum Magicians that pretty much can pendulum summon each other out, you're good to go. You're going to be able to do a board of multiple negations or disruptions during your opponent's turn. Because you have the pendulum summoning mechanic, you have the ability to go in and OTK your opponent rather easily. And not to mention, with Savage Strike right around the corner, Boarload Savage Dragon is going to be a card that we're getting that probably benefits Pendulum Magician more so than anything else, because it's another tool that they're going to have access to in the extra deck. So you kind of have this path that if you want to build this budget deck but also lay the foundation to maybe upgrade that Pendulum Magician deck, I think that's a really cool way, because yeah, Boarload Savage Dragon might have a high price tag, maybe not super expensive, but definitely more expensive than what you're going to be paying for a majority of the deck. But I like that just as a beginner option, or at least a budget option rather, because that way you can pretty much save up for those better cards, and Pendulum Magician probably isn't going to get hit on the ban list anytime soon, because yeah, while the deck is powerful, hasn't really been performing too well. This is definitely a stark comparison to the OCG, where they've probably hit the deck like 6 separate times now, and it's somehow still able to talk. That just goes to show how strong of a deck Pendulum Magician is, and definitely worthy of that number 4 slot. Coming in at number 3 though, we have another deck that actually managed to take first place at YCS Milan, and that is Prank Kids. Yes, I'm putting Prank Kids on this list, not only because they got first place at YCS Milan, but they've also been able to top several regionals and even take top slots at ARGs since winning Milan. So that just goes to show that it wasn't just this one-hit wonder that really did nothing after winning that event. It's been able to pursue and just completely actually have an effect on the format, and I think that's really awesome considering the fact that the deck is incredibly cheap. Pretty much all the cards you need came from a single set, and yeah, the field spell is expensive at like 10 to 12 bucks a piece, but when you look at everything else you need for the deck, you really don't need that much. And the thing is, this is another combo-centric deck, so you actually don't have to play hand traps, and by playing more combo pieces, you're going to be able to combo off as much as possible, meaning your deck's going to be more consistent. Even in the more standard Prank Kids builds that we've seen from Milan or any of these other events, the only hand traps they were really playing were Ash Blossom anyway, so if you just cut the 3 Ash Blossom for something else, it's like you already just made the budget version of the deck. Now, the one thing I will warn you about is that being a budget player and being this a budget deck, that doesn't mean the deck is easy. Prank Kids has a very high skill ceiling because there's so many different paths that the deck can take, so it definitely does not have an easy learning curve by any stretch of the imagination. But if you take the time, learn the different combos, and learn just how powerful the deck is, especially for the value, this deck could potentially take you very far, and who knows, you might even win the next YCS. That's gonna bring us on to number 2 though, and for number 2, we have yet another deck that made it on the top 5 meta decks of January 2019. And that is Altergeist. Now, one big caveat here is that I'm going to be talking about Altergeist without playing Infinite Impermanence. Now, I know playing Infinite Impermanence in this deck is kind of what makes it really good because you have the interaction with Multi-Faker, and honestly, if your opponent goes first and you have Multi-Faker Impermanence, that's kind of just like an auto win for you. But the thing is, Altergeist is still a very strong and very affordable deck if you take Impermanence out of the equation. The deck is very strong. It's a very good control deck. It might actually realistically be the only control deck we're going to be talking about on this list. So if you favor a more slower playstyle or you like playing trap-based decks, this is definitely going to be a deck for you. And then very similarly to like I was saying with Pendulum Magician and Borreload Savage Dragon, you can get the Altergeist deck for very, very cheap, and then if you can save up to get copies of Infinite Impermanence, which by the way is going to be reprinted in Dual Power not too long from now, that's going to give you a pathway to upgrading the deck and starting in at a very low price point. Altergeist is one of those decks that when it starts snowballing, you're going to just have your opponent completely on lockdown, and they're not going to be able to come back, because once you start summoning off those Hexdias, then it's just going to be game over. And honestly, the deck is so cheap outside of Impermanence, you could probably even afford to buy some other hand traps to help supplement the deck for if you're going second, and still have it within that $100 to $150 price point that I set for the standard of this video. It's an incredibly powerful deck. It's been able to garner multiple tops and multiple YCSs and just dominate the regional scene. It definitely had to make the list somewhere, and I'm pretty confident having it in at number 2. Now, before we move on to number 1, I did have one honorable mention I wanted to discuss, and that is Salamangreat, because yes, this could have gone to something like True Draco or ABC or Paleozoic. You know, there's plenty of other decks that you could make the argument for to be on this list, but I want to mention Salamangreat in particular because at the current moment, everything for this deck is dirt cheap, and it's only going to continue to go up as the hype from the OCG increases. Now, we're going to probably get a majority of the cards for this deck in the structure deck coming out in February, but if you want to start getting your hands on what's probably going to be one of the next tier 1 decks in a very short period of time, Salamangreat might be something you might want to start picking up just so you can be ahead of the curve, and then when that deck rolls around, that deck could be even more expensive than it is now, and you're going to be playing one of the best decks at a fraction of the price. But that's going to bring us on to our number 1 competitive budget deck of the January 2019 format, and if you haven't already figured it out, this surprised me. I'm going with Dark Warrior. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, how the fuck is Dark Warrior on the budget deck list? Well, it depends on how you build the deck. Now, when I'm talking about Dark Warrior here, I'm going to be focusing more so on Goki-oriented builds because the Goki engine is very strong and also very cheap since every card is like a common or a rare. What shocked me about this was that when you look at the main deck composition for a Goki Dark Warrior focused deck, everything in the main deck is like barely anything. Like the most expensive card might be a couple bucks at the most. And again, we talked about this multiple times throughout the video. Because it's a combo oriented deck, you don't have to run hand traps because you'd rather have more combo cards to help you combo off to make sure that you're going to Gumblar your opponent for 6 or do whatever it is that you choose to focus on with that Dark Warrior variant. Hell, even though there's stuff like Gossip Shadow that's like $30 at the moment, you could afford to buy a Gossip Shadow because the rest of the deck is so inexpensive by comparison that you're able to play a Rangaminiad Turbo variant or a Gumblar variant or just really any variant of Dark Warrior you wish. Now, the only exception to that rule is maybe integrating something like the Danger Monsters, because the Danger Monsters are very expensive, especially when you're trying to get like multiple playsets of Nessie and, you know, your Snake and like all those different other cards. But just looking at the core deck, I believe at YCS Pasadena, the deck that took second place, the main side and extra deck, I think was like barely over $200. Like that's also counting the side deck. That is just insane that a deck that's a fraction of the price of some of these other decks like Sky Striker, Thunder Dragon, and all that is able to get second place. So honestly, while again, it has another skill ceiling because it is a combo deck and you do have to learn the ins and outs of it because it can be rather punishing otherwise, you know, Isolde got reprinted, so that's like $1. Summon Sorceress got reprinted, so that's like a couple bucks. All the main cards in this deck got reprinted, and so yeah, besides like Gossip Shadow and maybe like a Borreload or a Boral Sword, everything else in the deck is so inexpensive, so you can play a tier 1 strategy for a fraction of what it might cost you. This is definitely a deck you should look into if you're a budget player, and definitely worthy of being the #1 competitive budget deck. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about your top competitive budget options for the January 2019 format. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.